Here today to do my thesis defense. I'm Ben Bornholm. I've been a student here for the past 5 years. Most of you know me. Who am I? Again, I'm Ben Bornholm. I have a bachelor's in networking and system administration from RIT, soon to be a computing security degree from RIT. I am the author of Hold My Beer Security. That is my blog. I am a DFIR engineer at Indeed. I was the president of RC3 when RC3 did exist, and I was the founder of Guardians of the Network for RIT Sec last year. So overview of my journey, right? That's really what I want to kind of do is kind of give you like a story of how I kind of did my thesis and give you kind of a journey of how I did this, right? So kind of the overview of my journey is what is the problem, what is the background so that we can move forward, the processes and methods that I use, the experiments and the results of those experiments, some discussion. Then we're going to talk about some of the contributions that I gave to the community from my actual research. And then we're going to have time for questions, roughly about 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to give a very high overview of my thesis. Overall, it was 150 pages single-spaced. So it's hard to condense that down into 40 minutes. So I'm going to kind of give a high overview. If there's anything that sounds really, really cool and you want me to go more in depth, save that for questions, and I'll go super in depth with you, but I'm going to try and keep it high level so we can keep moving. So trying out a new clicker here. OK, so what is the problem? The problem is we don't have a common language to describe the actions of adversaries from a network perspective. It's that simple. Our deliverable was our research changes the current landscape of MITRE attack by supplementing a network-based matrix. This research provides a framework that can be used as a common language to describe attackers from a network perspective. So if you're sitting there in your seat and you're like, he's 4 slides in and I'm totally lost, let's simplify this a little bit. What color is this? I like to be interactive, so yell out. What color is it? Too many people at once. Seafoam green. I heard teal. I heard blue. Anything else? Turquoise. Anything else? What? Cyan. Chris, you would actually be right. The most accurate answer is cyan. But it's really confusing that we all had these different ways of describing this one particular color. So this is the actual problem, right, is that there's multiple ways to kind of describe one thing, and it makes it really hard to communicate if we're doing it all in different ways. So just as this color is actually cyan, right, that's all my matrix is actually doing, is just providing a common language to describe adversaries on a network. So background. My background doesn't have good transitions. I'm just trying not to bore you, kind of get through some of the basic concepts so that we can all have a common language and talk about some of the things that I used in my thesis. So there's not really good transitions, so stick with me as we go through it. It's a little rough, but once we get through it, the rest of the presentation will be fine. So what is MITRE attack, right? It's just a list of techniques to describe the actions of attackers, right? So across the top is the attack phases, and then each attack phase is a column, and each column is filled with techniques. So this is kind of what it looks like, right? This is like the end result of MITRE attack. So for persistence, right, we have bash profile. Bash RC can be used for persistence. We got app init DLLs, right? These are different techniques that can be used for persistence, right? So this is MITRE at a very high level. So what is an APT? I've kind of been throwing around this word a lot. It stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. Our definition of APT for my thesis is an APT is they have advanced tooling to evade your security controls. So if you have security controls in place, they've put the time and effort to try and evade those. They have time. They also have money, so they're usually funded by government or cyber criminal entities. And they also have the personnel to maintain a presence on a network. There was one case of an APT where they were on a network for 700 days. That means a hacker was in someone's network for close to 2 years before they were detected, right? So this is a big problem. All right, so some examples of some APTs that we've seen in our real world. You may not have seen them or noticed that behind the scenes, these were APTs doing these things that affect our everyday lives. From an APT perspective, there's different motivations. Some of the most common ones are espionage, financial motivation, and intellectual property theft. So specifically, I have a note sheet because I couldn't remember this slide all off the top of my head, so stick with me. So APT 28, which is the nice little grizzly bear here. It has been hypothesized that APT 28 interfered with US elections in 2016. They did this by using social media outlets such as Facebook, Twitter, and other means. They've also been linked to compromising the Hillary Clinton campaign. They've also been linked to the Democratic National Committee breach as well. And during this breach, the National Committee breach, They were collecting intelligence such as intelligence based around defense and geopolitical issues. And this type of information collection is indicative of governments trying to do espionage, trying to collect information for government means. APT3 is a really big one. FireEye said they are probably one of the most sophisticated APTs that they've ever seen out of all the ones that they've done. Typically, APT3 will steal intellectual property, and this is a really big problem because APT3 has been linked to China's government, and specifically, there's a statistic out there that China has stolen close to $300 billion worth of IP, which is intellectual property, which affects all of you here, right? If your company spends millions and billions of dollars doing research and development, someone comes in at the end and just steals that and makes it for cheaper, that affects people here in the US. And then our last APT is MageCart here, which was very recent within the last year. MageCart was an APT that put credit card skimmers on websites. So basically, the websites were Ticketmaster, Newegg, and British Airlines. So when you went to go check out, it sent a credit card to the payment processor, but it also sent a credit card off to MageCart, right? So thousands and thousands of people were affected by these actors stealing credit cards. So for the kind of building the foundation of my matrix, I had to pick a model that would accurately describe the phases of an attack. So for the model that I chose for my thesis was the Bryant kill chain. And here are kind of the phases all laid out. So attack models are one of my favorite things to talk about. Some of you have actually attended my presentation of 40 minutes long on attack models. So we have reconnaissance here, right? If you're going to attack someone, you want to know as much information about the attacker. If you attended Scott's talk earlier today, talking about doing service enumeration, trying to figure out what ports are open on the network, right? Trying to figure out what services they're using, collecting documents, things like that. Delivery, you want to kind of have some mechanism of delivering your malicious payload to the user. So I always have the example of Sally in HR, right? That's the one I usually go with, right? You usually send a malicious document to Sally in HR, right? And that's your delivery phase. She usually gets in her email, and then she opens it up, and it runs some malicious code. That's usually the installation phase. And then we have this privilege escalation. Usually Sally will be a normal user on the machine, and this malicious code will try and escalate privileges to a higher context. So when you're on a network, you kind of want to do something called lateral movement, which is where you move from machine to machine around the network to try and find the machine that has your objective, right? So if your objective is stealing the credit card database, your lateral movement will be you trying to get to that actual credit card database to steal the credit cards. And then we have action on objectives where you get to that credit card database, and then you exfiltrate the database out. So that's kind of a high-level overview of what an attack kind of looks like. And then one of the tools that I used for my thesis was Zeek. It's formerly known as Bro. They just rebranded, same thing. So it monitors the network traffic and creates transaction logs of who's talking and how they're talking. So destination IP, source IP, destination port, source port, the protocol, and some protocol analysis. So if you're not familiar with this tool, think of like a phone call log, right? That's really all Bro's doing at the end of the day is like a phone call log of the actual network. So we know who's talking based on the phone numbers, right? We know when they talk, so maybe there's a date and time associated when the talk actually started and when it actually ended. How long they talk, so duration. Based on the area codes, that would indicate location of where that person is, right? Cell phones, so we could detect is it a cell phone or a landline. And then we can also do things like the provider. Was it Verizon or AT&T? From the transaction log, the only thing we don't know is the actual contents of the actual conversation. But we know who talked and how they talked. So you'll see these slides throughout the presentation. This is a break for me to breathe because I'm one of those people who loves to just speed through presentations. So any quick questions real quick? Kind of a thing to give me a chance to slow down a second, breathe. Any questions real quick? Cool. Whew. So off to process and methods. So overview, we're going to talk about how I actually built the foundational matrix. And then we're going to talk about kind of the way I went about doing experiment 1, 2, and 3. So building my foundational matrix, again, we had those attack themes. Those are the things across the top of the matrix, which describe the actual phases of an actual attack, right? So we use the Bryant kill chain, which I discussed earlier in this presentation, as our attack themes, and those are our column headings. And we actually fill in each column with actual attack techniques. So to do this, we reviewed APT reports. Specifically, we reviewed close to 2,000 APT reports. However, I did not read each APT report. That is not worth anyone's time. So to do it more effectively, we created a tool that would search all these PDFs for keywords. So I came out with a common keyword list and sent out the scanner scanning all these PDFs. And then I would review these PDFs later. So what that tool actually looked like is specifically for the phase of command and control. I said one keyword of command and control is command and control. Also, C2 is a synonym of command and control. So here are all the APT reports that contain the keyword command and control, or C2. Right? It makes my life a lot easier to know which documents actually open and read them for context. So after all this work, here is the foundational matrix. Right? Here are all the techniques that I got from all the APT reports. Here's kind of the first version of this matrix before we even start our experiments. So this is kind of what it looked like before we started our experiments. And these were all techniques gotten from APT reports. So if you actually click on one of those cells, specifically the HTTP cell, what you'll get is a quick description, some common information about the technique itself, some common ports about the technique, and each technique will have this section, malware threat and actors. And this is really important, is that this section contains all the references about that technique. So if I have a technique on my matrix, it is backed up by an APT report saying that it used it. So specifically, we have the threat actor IceFrog using HTTP in the years 2013, and here are 2 PDF reports claiming that. Here's NetTraveler, which is actually a specific piece of malware used by an APT. Here are the years that this malware was active, and there is the actual APT report where that thing is referenced. So everything is backed up by an actual APT report. So this slide has a lot going on here, but at the end of each experiment, I end with a heat map and a key. So basically how this actually works is, here's the key. The key is showing you the color scale here, so which colors did I use, and kind of a definition of what each color means, and it kind of gives you a count of each color and then a percentage out of 100. So here, what this heat map up here is actually showing is the prevalence of a technique in APT reports. So specifically the technique compression here, right? It's green, which means 5 or more sources say that that technique has been used by APTs. This one that's in red, domain spoofing, is the color red. It shows that only 1 APT report says that that's been used. Any questions so far? What's up?
Where did you find all those APT reports?
There is, if you type in APT reports, space GitHub on Google, there's an APT repository. So I just used that. So that was my source. Sure.
How comfortable are you with the keyword mapping?
The keyword mapping? Yeah. I'm going to kind of cover that at the end of my presentation, but I did the best of my ability to kind of create the best keyword list that I could, but that also means that if I didn't have a keyword, I'm going to be missing some things. But I did the best I could through reading reports and trying to find similar synonyms and doing some extra research on top of that to make sure that I had pretty good keyword lists. So that is one thing that would stop an actual technique from showing up on the matrix, and I will cover that at the end.
Can you go back to heat maps for a second?
Yep.
What is the implication of single source? You're saying that this is just a limited use of this particular technique, and if I find this, then somebody is either leading the field or something else, or are you implying that, say, the ones that are green 5+ sources, these are really common script kiddie kind of things? What's the relationship between these? What kind of conclusions might I?
So there's multiple different ways. Some actors will only, and we'll see this later in my presentation, is some techniques on my matrix will only be used by one threat actor, right? Over the course of a decade, that's only been seen once by one particular threat actor. So there's one thing, and that could be used for attribution. But it's really just saying out of the APT reports, these are the most prevalent techniques that we saw from all the APT reports. So that's what this is trying to convey.
You're not drawing conclusions from this point. You're just
Not drawing conclusions, just showing APT relevance or prevalence. So experiment 1, APT reports. I had 4 different test cases in experiment 1. I reviewed APT 3, the Lazarus group, the Iranian cyber espionage group, and APT 28. And as I did this, I used the MITRE model for recording a summary of each APT group. So that MITRE model includes a description of the threat actor, known aliases of the threat actor. So APT28 goes by several other different names than just APT28. They know like as, I think, Grizzly Bear, Fuzzy Bear, so many other names. They all use different techniques, so a list of techniques that each actor has done, and then the known tools or malware that each actor used, and then my references for this. So some reasons why I chose these specific 4 APT groups. As I kind of alluded to earlier, APT3, stated by FireEye, is one of the most sophisticated APTs that they've seen. They usually steal IP, they steal intellectual property, as we talked about earlier. They also created custom tools for the environments that they were attacking, and they're a famous APT group, and they are typically a group that is emulated by adversary emulation products, which we're going to be talking about in a little bit, but this is kind of just a foreshadow to that. The Lazarus group, I'll be honest, when I was reading APT reports, this just seemed like a really cool report. So that's one reason it made it in, because I just thought it was really cool to learn about this particular group. This APT group is actually ongoing. Lazarus is still an ongoing APT. I was reading a report the other day on Twitter about them, how someone had detected Lazarus group in their network, right? So they're still an ongoing APT. And then another reason why we chose Lazarus group is you're never in control of who's actually going to attack your network. You may have an idea of the type of attackers that may attack your network based on the type of business or the type of things that are in your network or type of motivation of attackers, but you're never actually going to be in control of that, right? So a random group could actually attack you not as the primary target, but as a secondary target. They may actually attack your network and then use you to kind of obscure their traffic coming from a trusted network to their primary target, right? So that's why we kind of looked at Lazarus group as this kind of like a random APT from all the selection to kind of say you should be able to detect APTs, not the ones that you think are going to target you, but also any ones that could target you. And then the Iranian cyber group, this was actually really cool test case and report to read. The Iranian cyber espionage group is actually affiliated with multiple APT groups. And a lot of people have a lot of different controversy of which APT groups they're associated with. But the one thing that was common across all the groups is that it was an Iranian actor. That was the one thing that everyone kind of agreed on. And it was really cool to read this report is that you got to see how this group evolved over time, which was really cool. And as they evolved over time, they came out with new and better techniques, but they also kept some of the same techniques over time. So over a 5-year period, techniques that they were used in their very first campaign were seen in some of their later campaigns, which means that if you were able to detect that technique early on, you could detect them later on, which is really cool. And then APT28, as I already talked about, they have been hypothesized to interfere with our election, right? The United States election in 2016. So, outcomes for an experiment 1, we used open source threat intelligence about our threat actors, right? We calculated the efficacy of our matrix against the known APT. And it is also a repeatable experiment. And we also made sure that when we reviewed APT3, this is really important because this will come in experiment 2, is that we could properly emulate APT3 in experiment 2, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it made sure that we knew what APT3 was and what they were doing. And also, as a final thing, we also detected new techniques for our matrix. So as we were doing these APT reports, we actually discovered that there were some techniques being used by these 4 groups that we didn't actually have on our matrix, which actually shows that our matrix is a system. So that means that we can constantly be adding and updating our actual matrix, right, to reflect how attackers evolve over time. So experiment 2, adversary emulation. So adversary emulation is the process of emulating the behavior of an adversary in your environment. So you may actually create some malware that will look like a particular threat actor and drop that into your environment and see, hey, can we actually detect or prevent this type of actor in our environment? And that's really what adversary emulation is trying to do. And we specifically did that with the Scythe platform, and we emulated APT3. Remember back in experiment 1, we reviewed APT3 from reports, so we knew exactly what Scythe's platform was doing, and we made sure that they were emulating APT3 correctly. So for my actual environment, I created a Windows domain. So that Windows domain had a domain controller and 2 Windows clients connected to it. And then this entire environment was monitored by Zeek. So Zeek was monitoring all the network traffic on this actual environment. And this is kind of like a network diagram here of kind of how that looked like. So the outcomes from experiment 2. So we demonstrated that APT activity could be detected from the network, specifically with Zeek. So we proved that, and we showed that and demonstrated that. We calculated the efficacy of our matrix versus APT3, and we demonstrated how to hunt for adversaries on a network. And to back that up, we actually have specific Splunk queries. And then we did experiment 3. Experiment 3 was kind of cool. We reviewed the 2017 National Ccdc Pcap dataset. So Ccdc is a big collegiate cyber defense competition at the collegiate level. RAT actually competes in it. And it's a really huge red versus blue. So the red team is a bunch of professional pen testers and red teamers for an industry. And the blue team is actually students from colleges such as RAT. And the blue team has to actually protect an enterprise environment from the red team. And the red team just pretty much just tries to attack them all weekend long. And it's a really fun time. I did it a couple years ago. And the really nice thing about this is we have benign and malicious traffic during Ccdc, so we were able to not say everything's malicious, but there is some benign traffic. So just like an enterprise environment, there is benign traffic. There also may be malicious traffic. And with this experiment, we converted the Pcaps into Zeek logs. So there is close to 2 terabytes worth of Pcaps. I converted them into Zeek logs, and I think at the end I was able to get 2 terabytes worth of Pcaps down to about a gig worth of Zeek logs. And those Zeek logs have been put on a website for public consumption. So really cool, and I provided that to the community. And then we analyzed these Zeek logs with Splunk. So the outcome from this experiment demonstrated APT activity can be detected from a network perspective, especially in an enterprise environment. As I already stated before, each blue team gets an environment like an enterprise environment, so we were actually able to show that we could detect APT in an enterprise environment, specifically with Zeek. And we got to the ability to evaluate all the techniques on our matrix with this actual data set. So that was actually really cool, is to be able to go through every single technique, where some of the previous experiments we were kind of targeted at which techniques. And I'll explain that in a little bit. So experiment and results. So again, we had 3 experiments. The first one was review of APT reports. The second experiment was adversary emulation. And the last experiment was NCCDC Pcap dataset. So first experiment, here's the first heat map here, right? This is pretty much everything in green was the prevalence of a technique that we saw in all the APT reports. Anything that's kind of like an orange or a red was a technique that didn't exist on our matrix before we did the experiment. So these are the things that are in red and orange were techniques that were added to the matrix after the analysis of experiment 1. So I'm going to kind of skip to the next slide to kind of show you the results and then flip back for you guys. So here's kind of the key and the color breakdown. So everything in green, starting here at the top, this color green, at least 1 threat actor used that particular technique. And then this color shows that at least 2 threat actors and so on. And again, as I already described, anything in orange/red is a technique that didn't exist on our matrix, but we added it after experiment 1. So our final result down here was our matrix was 75% effective at detecting APTs for experiment 1 against 4 different APT groups. So kind of just flipping back. Good? For experiment 2, it's really simple. We only had 5 different techniques that were going to be emulated through the Scythe platform. And out of those 5 techniques, there was only 1 that we couldn't detect. So all the other ones we did detect. So kind of a more simpler key here is showing that we were 8% effective with our matrix at detecting APT3. And then for the Ccdc Pcap dataset, everything in green was a technique that we were able to observe in the Pcap dataset, and everything in yellow was something that we weren't able to detect or an absence of that actual activity happening. So specifically, maybe through my analysis, I couldn't actually find an actual technique being used, but it was used, but I'll never really know that. So that's why it was denoted as yellow, or they just didn't use it at all. But unfortunately, we'll probably never know unless I sit down with an actual person from the Ccdc team. So, but everything in green was something that we could actually confirm that we actually did see in the Pcap. And everything in green does have a Splunk query standing behind it, proving that we did find it. So we were close to 66% effective with detecting the red team at Ccdc. So here is kind of the final heat map, bringing all the experiments together. So anything in red means that we didn't detect that technique at all in any of our experiments. Anything in yellow means at least one of our experiments showed that that was an actual technique being used. Anything in orange means that two of our experiments showed that that technique was being used. And anything in green means out of all three of our experiments show that technique being used. And here's kind of our breakdown. So pretty good. I would say only 4 techniques from my original matrix weren't detected through our experiments. I'd say that's pretty good. Any questions so far?
So, I'm not sure I understand. When you say the technique is not observed, do you mean the technique actually exists in the data, but not being observed through your metrics? Or do you mean those techniques just exist?
So it could be either or. So specifically for the Ccdc Pcap dataset, they could have used a technique and I just didn't find it through my analysis, right? Or it could be that they didn't use that technique at all, right? There's no guarantee that they used all the techniques on the matrix, right? And we'll never really know that for sure, just like real life. But from the actual analysis of the data set, everything in green was things that we could find indicators of that technique being used.
But if you go to your APT report, your APT report, yes. So I also don't understand the red here.
Okay.
The key next,
Yep. So specifically, let's say covert communications here. Specifically covert communications, this technique did not exist on my matrix when I did experiment 1. But after reading the APT reports, I found that covert communications was a technique that was being used by these APT reports, and I added it to the matrix. So this is showing that when I did the actual experiment, anything in red didn't exist before the experiment, but afterwards it did.
but public communication is part of the attack framework. Do you mean this was not in the attack framework?
So specifically to that question, that's a really great question, is that when I started this project, that column on MITRE ATT&CK didn't actually exist. So depending on when they actually added that column, that column may not have actually existed. And
You started with like minor attack framework from maybe a year ago,
yeah,
and then some is red, you want to add it by minor or by you.
yep, correct. Yeah. Any other questions?
So, give me a second, because I have a couple. Specifically, you're using Bro/Zeek
Mm-hmm.
to perform your detections.
Yep.
Are you writing custom rules for that, or if you're not writing custom rules, where are you getting the data set of rules to use for your detection? Because if there's not a rule written for it, it makes sense to me that you're not going to detect it.
Great question. So this kind of has like 2 answers. Zeek has actually come a really long way in the past year or so. They actually have a repository of rules that you can actually install. It's called the Zeek Package Manager. So I used a bunch of those rules and detection rules from their actual set to actually help me enhance my detection. So that's one answer. But also some things kind of come down to analytics and how to actually review the data via math or other things, which I got from blog posts and different journals online of how to do detection. So some of them were Bro rules, some of them were just analyzing the data.
Okay, and the second part of my question revolves around Zeek is looking at network traffic.
Correct.
But it doesn't have the ability to decode certificate encrypted communication.
No, it does not.
So some of the things that you didn't detect, Mimikatz, for example,
Sure.
can be delivered 3 different ways, right?
Yep.
We can take a file and drop it on the Windows box. We can deliver that over an encrypted tunnel through interpreter, and there's a third way that I just
Sure,
I
yeah.
can't puke out at the top of my head here, right? So it makes sense that you might miss Mimikatz. Do you think that some of the others are as a result of the content being encrypted, and how might you address
Yep. So some of these things are going to be an absence of this is going to be that the stream was encrypted. But I'm actually going to touch on that at the end of my presentation. So any other questions?
What level, I don't know if you said this before, I think a little late. What level of the network was this Pcap actually captured at? So like, you obviously won't be able to see ARP spoofing if you're not capping on the network on the same layer.
So you're saying the local network? So specifically for the environment that I use, it was just a local network, so I could see everything that was happening, including ARP spoofing. But if you're in an enterprise environment, you may not be on each local network. So
Yeah, so
Yeah.
for like the Ccdc Pcap, was that like an IPS layer, or was that different caps across the network?
I'm not actually sure. It just looked like layer 3 for the most part. So, cool. Any other questions?
So earlier you talked about this evolution or changes. Do you have any result that shows that?
Yep, I'll show you all that kind of at the end, kind of how I evolved over time with all this. So,
How did Zeke monitor your environment? How is it set up?
so it's basically you have a network switch and you put it on a span port. That's usually the best way to do it. Cool. All right, discussion. We're almost here at the end. So really, as you guys have seen and through your questions, this is a work in progress. It's not perfect. I'm not saying this is the end all be all. This is the perfect work, right? It's still a work in progress. And what I'm hoping to do is in the future is kind of get community involvement to actually make it better. So some reasons why some techniques actually might be missing, and some of you kind of alluded to this. These are a couple hypotheses of why I think some techniques on my matrix are actually missing. So hypothesis 1, APT reports that I used initially to create my initial matrix just didn't contain the techniques that I needed, right? There were several people who said, well, I've seen this in my environment before, but your matrix doesn't have it. Well, if it didn't exist in an APT report, it doesn't exist on my matrix. And that's just kind of the way that this works, specifically from a research standpoint. Techniques are only accessible via paid subscription. This one's pretty easy. We just didn't have access to paid subscriptions for security stuff. So it's as simple as that. Security companies don't publicly release their findings, right? Some companies are really good at releasing their findings, like FireEye and Mandiant, but some companies are not. So if they don't publicly release it, I didn't really get it. Special environments like SCADA weren't observed for my experiments, so some of those techniques for those specific type of environments do not exist on my matrix. There is a lag time between APT activity to discovering to public disclosure. So specifically with APT1, which is the first APT that kind of started this whole trend of APT, they started at the end of the 1990s, the early 2000s. Mandiant started looking into APT1 around 2004, so that means there was like a 4-year gap before Mandiant started focusing their efforts on this APT. Then in 2010, Mandiant released a report, their yearly report, and in their yearly report, they talked about APT1, so, but at a very high level. And then in 2013, I think, or 2014, APT1 report was actually officially released. So that means almost 14 years later, we got intelligence about the specific threat actor, right? So that's a really big lag time. And then as we found out really early on is a lot of APT reports only focus on certain areas of the attack lifecycle, or they only focus on the actual malware that was discovered and things like that. So there's going to be some absences. If you don't cover the entire attack lifecycle, there's going to be some absences in what is recorded in reports and what we actually got for techniques. And then, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is that my keyword list may not have included a particular keyword, and if it didn't, I may not have found that technique. And that's just kind of one of those things that just kind of happens. But the good thing from all this is it's all areas for future research. So our matrix was designed to guide threat hunters, and specifically guide threat hunters in hypothesis generation, right? So usually with threat hunting, you're going to start with a hypothesis, and you're going to try and go out into your network and try and detect malicious activity to prove or disprove your hypothesis. So really, this matrix was designed to help threat hunters do exactly that. And as some people have alluded to, the MITRE attack matrix, as it currently stands, does have a network column, specifically command and control, but their focus is only on command and control, where our matrix has other phases of the attack lifecycle from a network perspective. All right, defense in depth, as a lot of people have already alluded to, and Bill Stackpole, network monitoring is pointless as everything is encrypted these days. This is where defense in depth is really important, right? Sure, everything's encrypted, but it doesn't mean we just give up. So pretty much the defense in depth motto from SANS is having a multiple layers of security, right? Like an onion, you have multiple layers of security controls to hopefully detect, right? So if a stream is encrypted, one way is to kind of pivot to the endpoint for actual detection. But what if an endpoint has a rootkit or malware that's deleting logs, right? It wouldn't be that helpful to actually go to that endpoint for actual analysis. So some different things that we can kind of get from encrypted streams, specifically with Zeek, is we still have JA3 hashes. We still have the SIN in a cert, which is kind of like the domains for that particular cert. We have the domain in the SSL handshake that we can use. We have the SHA-1 hash of the actual certificate that's being used. We can detect if it's a self-signed cert, which is usually a really big indicator, or we can detect the actual signer of the cert. And there's a bunch of other things, but these are just some quick highlights. And so, as I've already alluded to, malware could use encrypted communications, but it may perform some local network operations which can actually detect, right? So this is that defense in depth kind of coming back. So ping sweep, right? One box is talking to 200 different boxes with ping. That's kind of an odd thing, depending, maybe it's a network administrator, then it's probably an okay thing. But if it's Sally in HR pinging everyone's, that's kind of an indicator, right? Knowing who should be talking to who is really the biggest thing that this all comes down to, is really knowing who should be talking to who, and how they should be communicating is really going to be the two big things helping you. So doing a network intrusion detection system comparison. So MITRE compared EDR platforms with their MITRE attack matrix. So they said, this platform detected this, but this platform didn't, right? So taking that same concept that MITRE did, you could do that with our matrix, but with network-based appliances. EDR is endpoint detection and response. So like Carbon Black, other antivirus products. So if a salesman comes to you, kind of guy like this, telling you that his product does all the fancy things, well, maybe you can take that network appliance, apply it to my matrix, and be like, maybe it's not as good as you really say it is, right? Really put it into numbers, really show it. All right. The network heat map, this is actually a really cool thing, as I've seen and shown this to you guys a couple of times throughout this actual presentation. Evaluate your network detection capabilities. So basically, when you evaluate your detection capabilities, you will have some type of color scale. So you can say everything that's green on our heat map is areas where we have detection. Everything that's red is areas for improvement. And you can show your security team's improvement over time. So if you create a heat map at, like, say, Q1, and you do a lot of things to build security controls at the network thing, you can show that your detection has gotten better over time because more of those cells should go from red to green. And this is a really, really popular approach with the C-level executives, right? They don't want an 80-page report of what your security team has done over the past year, but if you can hand them a heat map going, this is what we did, this is where we were at the beginning of the year, and this is where we are now, and you can see that you've gone from red to green, that's a really effective way in only one page to show them that your security team is doing awesome things. So this type of approach can be applied to my matrix as well. And here is the final matrix. So here is, after all this work and all this talking and all this, here's the final thing. So we're almost at the end. So contributions, that Python PDF keyword extractor where it scanned all the PDFs for keywords and showed me which PDFs to look at, that's on GitHub. I added support for Zeek logs to Endgame's EQL tool. There is a Jekyll website for my matrix on GitHub, and this is really important because this allows the community to actually have input on my matrix and actually provides a public discussion forum for people to provide feedback on the matrix and actually provide like new techniques and stuff. And as a community, we can actually do that in a public discussion on GitHub. The public data sets, so I use this data set for some testing. I converted the Pcaps to Zeek logs. Those are now public. Experiment 2, the Pcaps for Experiment 2, which is the Adversary Emulation, are now public. The Zeek logs for it are also public. Experiment 3, where I converted 2 terabytes worth of data into Zeek logs, that's also public as well. And I have a GitHub repo with all this work. So many thanks to my loving parents, which are here today and in the back. My very supportive girlfriend, mostly moral support. And this community for guiding me through this experience. RITSec has been a wonderful experience through my college career, and I love learning from all of you guys and teaching all of you guys. So, last thing, last slide. This bit.ly link is specifically a survey about my actual matrix, and me and Justin, moving forward, are actually going to do some things with this actual survey moving forward with actual future research. So if you guys could take the time to actually go to this survey and actually fill it out, that'd be really great, because we're hoping to get community feedback about my actual matrix to hopefully make it better and hopefully release it full time for actually people to start using. So that's the end of my presentation. So time for questions specifically from the committee. You got 20 minutes to grill me. Quiet is what I was hoping for.
So we have one of the committee members is the
will go to the community and look at. Always the preference for local question field and we tend to alienate the outside. So, Rob, do you have anything in particular that you'd like to cover?
He said good work.
That's
Anything else from the committee? We do have a couple questions in the back that I see.
I think I've asked mine during the.
All right.
Yeah, and I hammered you with stuff that I cared about along the way to ask, so I'm good with everything. So go ahead.
Kirsty?
I have rather a two-part question. So you said in your original thing about how you gathered all of your APT reports. Obviously, speaking as someone from Indian, we don't disclose all of our intel on specific APT groups because we don't want to burn DPs. This is a known thing for even the attackers. So are you planning on working with or pitting different people from different large companies like Iranian, CrowdStrike, all that stuff, people who are working with MITRE themselves to kind of help build out the attack framework?
So, you done? Or
Yeah, that's
okay.
part of the question.
Great. So when I started out this project, I really wanted to kind of hand over this matrix to MITRE or work with MITRE. But now since I'm at the end of my project, I'm kind of exhausted and I kind of want a couple months to kind of relax. But also I'm going to be doing some future research with Justin and that survey that's currently here on the slide to kind of get community feedback, kind of use that community feedback, and then hopefully work with companies like you've suggested. Part of that is also getting contacts and finding people who are interested in working with me. So yes, I do want to work with the community. So it's kind of an ongoing process. It just hasn't happened for this particular thesis.
Awesome. And then the second part of the question is, obviously you said earlier that the attack framework, when you first started, it's changed significantly with all of the different research that has been happening and publicly released, right? So at the end of your research and before this presentation, did you ever do a comparison between the matrix that you have created versus what is now available by MITRE and see where the overlap is?
Yes, and I did it earlier this week, to be honest, kind of before this defense, because I knew that was something that was going to come up. There is some overlap. We do have some common things. And as I was actually building this matrix, I kind of looked at some of the common keywords that MITRE does use so that the same language is being used on either side. But they seem to kind of fit everything into this command and control column where I kind of separate things out into separate attack phases. So I think that's kind of more a philosophy discussion of where things actually belong between our two matrices.
No, I mean, this is great stuff. Like, you don't want to utilize
So.
verbiage essentially to talk about network stuff. And like Bill says in all these classes, everything's encrypted, so if you're not encrypting when you're monitoring, you've got nothing. So I think that's probably why MITRE is focused on endpoint.
Yep.
This is definitely really great for all of the students that are out there just doing their own security stuff and don't have the, like you said, the paid subscriptions to all the intel portals. Gives them a really great place to start.
Yep. Also, just kind of pivoting off of that is the reason I chose Zeek is because it's an open source platform, so that means anyone can use it. And just because it's an open source project doesn't mean huge enterprises aren't using it. There's actually a case study of Zeek being used on a 100 gig pipe to actually analyze a 100 gig pipe. So it's been used in small businesses and it's been used at the biggest end. So the gentleman in the black.
Great work. Again, so your presentation results talk about all four APTs. If you look at how they are overlapping or different based on the metrics, are they similar, not similar to the techniques based on the metrics, and in what way they're different and similar?
So scroll all the way back. So if we kind of use this, right, this is only out of those 4 APT reports that we were talking about. This is showing, hey, out of the 4 APT groups, there was a specific techniques of this color that were used by all 4. So that's kind of that metrics to show the similarity between them, but also the differences between them come from different base colors and also these red stuff, you know.
8 out of 54 is not big.
What was that?
Interesting. So 8 out of 54 total is
Yep.
not that big.
Nope.
Have you looked at actual contacts? Which 8 are similar? Which ones are very unique and are generating some understanding not easily discoverable by reading the thread reports.
Sure. So specifically HTTP, right? It's a really common thing used by all 4 of our things. So there's to address that point. And then I think it was this color that we only saw one particular APT group use DNS, right? So this is kind of what the heat map is showing. But some of the things that we didn't have on our matrix to begin with, the ones that are orange and red, kind of allude to those very unique things that kind of do what you're talking about and kind of hinting to is attribution. So those very rare techniques that are only used by one particular group are the attribution side of all of this. So that's why we kept those ones that are not so prevalent on our matrix, because they can be used for attribution. Good? Any other questions?
So, 2 questions. One, moving forward, what do you think your next step with this would be?
Sure, still listening.
Is there any particular method or anything that you want to implement next?
So my next thing is hopefully people fill out the survey. So being able to get as many people to fill this out is definitely the next step. Hopefully getting community input from other people will be kind of my next step type of thing. So not really sure where I'm going to go with it after that. I kind of want to see what the community has to say before I kind of put my foot down on what my next steps are, because maybe they have a totally different outlook that I never saw, or maybe we're all on the same page. I doubt it. I think if we ask more people, we'll all have different outcomes of what are the next steps. So I think that's the best.
All right. And then my second question is, if you could implement one dream feature into this, what would that be?
Oh, one dream feature. So I'm kind of doing some of this work at work itself, and being able to create a heat map of all your detection areas is actually really hard. And a lot of companies actually talk about how great it is to actually show like a heat map of where your detection lies, but they don't actually tell you how to get to that end state. So I think that would be something that would be really useful to the community, is that I talked about creating a heat map of all your detection capabilities, but actually getting to that end result is actually really hard. So maybe providing some type of way for people to actually accomplish that objective faster, easier guidance. Any other questions? Sweet. So I'll be around for the most of today, and I guess in the back lobby if anyone have any additional questions that they want to ask me. Is there anything else from the committee itself? I got a thumbs up. I'll take it. I think that means passing. Okay, it means passing.